Chapter 5, Trial by Family. For the first time, Bristol understood what it was like to be scared senseless. There were heavy shackles around her wrists, but she didn't feel them. The smell of decaying rats and mildew filled the air, but it didn't bother her. Blood-curdling screams of prisoners getting whipped echoed through the halls, but she hardly noticed them. Her eyes were fixated on the steel bars surrounding her, but she didn't understand what she was looking at. She was sitting straight up on the edge of the stone bench in her prison cell and hadn't moved a muscle since she was placed there. Everything happened so fast the night before she couldn't remember where she was or how she got there. Then again, she was in such a state of shock she could barely think at all. At dawn, the ear-piercing cathedral bells didn't even make Bristol flinch. It was now the morning after the worst night of her life, but she had no conception of time. Her mind was completely blank, her body was completely still, and as far as she was concerned, the world had stopped spinning. Her cell door swung open and a prison guard stepped inside, but his arrival didn't break her petrified trance. "Your defense deputy justice has arrived," the guard said. After hearing this, Bristol was finally able to make sense of where she was and what had happened. She, Bristol Evergreen, had been imprisoned for a crime. She was sitting in the prison deep below the Chariot Hills courthouse, and the deputy justice assigned to defend her had to come speak with her about the pending trial. The guard stepped aside, and a tall young man in a black hat and a gray and black checkered robe entered the cell. When Bristol gazed up at the deputy justice, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. "Brooks?" she said. Her eldest brother froze after taking his first step into the prison cell. His eyes went wide and his face grew pale at the sight of his sister in chains. "Bristol!" he gasped. The Evergreen siblings stared at each other for a full minute without saying a single word. It was the only time in Bristol's life that she had been genuinely pleased to see her brother, but the pleasure quickly faded as she realized why he was there. Brooks was going to defend her in court. "Brooks, I... Bristol tried to break the silence, but she was at a loss for words. "Do you two know each other?" the guard asked suspiciously. As Brooks stared at his sister, the disbelief in his eyes changed into a very serious and urgent expression. He raised his index finger to his mouth, imploring her to be quiet. Bristol didn't understand why the silence was necessary, but she obliged. "We're acquainted," Brooks told the guard behind him. "She's just one of the many schoolgirls who admire me, but who can blame her?" Her brother's charade was confusing. She knew it was perfectly legal for deputy justices to defend family members on trial, so why was he pretending they weren't related? Brooks opened his briefcase and retrieved a quill and a piece of parchment. He scribbled a quick note on the paper, folded it, and handed it to the guard. "I need you to deliver this message to Justice Evergreen's office on the 4th floor. Brooks instructed. "I was just reminded of something involving another case that needs to be addressed immediately." "Sir, I can't leave you alone with the prisoner," the guard replied. "Don't insult me. This girl is hardly a physical threat. The note, however, regards a very serious and timely matter. Justice Evergreen will want this message right away, and if your reluctance jeopardizes his case, I'll make sure he knows you caused the delay." Obviously, the guard didn't appreciate being ordered around. He glared at Brooks and then begrudgingly headed to the 4th floor with the note in hand, slamming the cell door behind him. Brooks turned to Bristol and the disbelief returned to his face. "My God, Bristol, what the hell have you gotten yourself into?" he exclaimed. "One count of trespassing, one count of female literacy, and one count of committing magic? Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Bristol looked to the floor and shook her head. "I don't know what to say," she said softly. "It all feels like a bad dream. When you weren't at breakfast this morning, Mother assumed you had gone to the home for the helpless to volunteer before school," Brooks said. "When I got to the courthouse, all the deputy justices were talking about the witch they caught in the library last night, but I didn't put the two together. I never imagined in a million years the witch would be my own sister." "But I'm not a witch!" Bristol exclaimed. "The banned book I was reading explains everything. Please, you have to find it and show it to. Are you mad?" Brooks asked. "I can't use a banned book as evidence." "Then what are we going to use for my defense?" Bristol asked. "Defense?" Brooks said, as if he was appalled by her choice of words. "Bristol, you were caught by 3 witnesses. There's no defense. You're facing life imprisonment with hard labor for committing magic alone, but with trespassing and female literacy on top of it, you'll be lucky to make it out of here alive." "You mean they might execute me?" Bristol felt like a cold hand had suddenly reached into her body and ripped out her stomach. She had willingly gone down a long path of mistakes, but she had never thought it would lead to this. She started hyperventilating. "No, this can't be happening," she cried. "You can't let them execute me. Please, Brooks, you have to help me. I'm your sister." Brooks rolled his eyes at the remark. "Oh, yes, and what a joy you are," he said spitefully. "I'm afraid even with my superb defense skills, my hands are tied." "There has to be something we can do." Her brother went quiet and he bit his nails as he thought about it. "There's only one thing I can think of that could possibly help you now." "What?" "Father." Brooks said it like it was good news, but it only made Bristol feel more hopeless than before. Her father was the last person on the planet she expected to save her. "Father isn't going to help me," she said. "When he finds out what I've done, he'll want to kill me himself." "Well, you're right about that," Brooks scoffed. "Father may not value your life, but he thinks very highly of his own. He would do anything to preserve his reputation. And nothing is going to tarnish his name more than one of his children getting arrested and sentenced to death. Luckily for him, I'm the only one who knows you're in here." "How?" "As far as anyone knows, this is the case of Bailey versus the Southern Kingdom. The charges have been filed under the alias you gave the library. When Father gets my note and realizes you're the one on trial, he's going to do whatever he can to sweep this case under the rug before his colleagues find out." "But what if he doesn't?" Bristol asked. "Father can't be my only chance of survival." "Then it all depends on your trial," Brooks explained. "First, the prosecution deputy will present your charges to the sitting justice and recommend a penalty. If they recommend the minimum penalty, the justice will most likely sentence you to life imprisonment with hard labor. But if the deputy recommends the maximum penalty, I guarantee the justice will sentence you to capital punishment. But the sitting justice doesn't have to take the recommendation. It's just a suggestion," Bristol recalled from what she had read. "Even if the prosecution deputy recommends the maximum penalty, the justice could still be merciful." Brooks' face fell flat and Bristol knew there was something he wasn't telling her. "There won't be any mercy this time," he said. "Your trial is being overseen by Justice Aldragade." "Who?" "Justice Aldragade is the most despised justice in the court system. He has a God complex and is notorious for condemning people to death whenever possible. Even when prosecution deputies recommend the minimum penalty, Oldregade likes to bully them into recommending the maximum penalty just so he can enforce it. "Oh my gosh," Bristol gasped. "It gets worse," Brooks went on. "Oldregade has hated Father since their days at the University of Law. During their time as deputy justices, Father never lost a case against Oldregade and would humiliate him during the trials. That's the reason he assigned me to your defense. It's impossible for a defense deputy to win a case like this, and he wanted to watch an evergreen lose. And Oldregade would be thrilled to sentence you to death if he had the chance." Bristol couldn't believe her misfortune. She was getting punishment not only by the laws of the Southern Kingdom, but also apparently by the universe itself. "Then I'm doomed," she said quietly. "There's no way around it." "There's still one thing in our favor that you're forgetting," Brooks reminded her. "Like I said, as far as anyone knows, this is the case of Bailey versus the Southern Kingdom. Justice Oldregade doesn't know who you are. Trials usually don't begin until a day or two after incarceration, so hopefully that'll give Father enough time to help you before Oldregade finds out." "So that's why you pretended we weren't related in front of the guard. You didn't want anyone to realize who I am." "Exactly." Bristol never thought a day would come when she was thankful for having a brother like Brooks, but here it was. All the calculating and mischievous qualities she resented about him were now the tools he was using to save her life. "I'm so scared, Brooks," she said. "Well, you should be," he said. "Even if Father finds a way to help you, you aren't going to walk out of here freely. Best case scenario, you'll probably spend the rest of your life in a prison far away from Chariot Hills." "I suppose you think I deserve it for being so stupid," she said through tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted life to be different." "Then I guess you got what you asked for." The door swung open as the guard returned to the cell. He was wheezing and sweating profusely from his journey to and from the 4th floor. "I delivered your message to the justice, sir," the guard grumbled. "Just in time, too. I'm all finished here." Brooks picked up his briefcase and headed for the door, but Bristol stopped him as he stepped into the hall. "Deputy Justice Evergreen?" she asked. "If you happen to see them, will you please give my love to my mother and my brother, and tell them I am so, so sorry for all of this?" Her brother gave the slightest nod possible without attracting the guard's attention. "I'm not your messenger, criminal," he said dramatically. "See you in court." Brooks continued down the hall and the guard followed, locking the cell behind him. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Bristol was consumed by the most extreme sorrow she had ever experienced. She lay on the stone bench and wept until there wasn't a teardrop left inside her. As far as she knew, her brother was the last piece of home she'd ever see again. That night, Bristol was jolted awake when her cell door suddenly burst open. 2 prison guards charged inside, grabbed her by the arms, and forced her onto her feet. Without saying a word, the guards rushed Bristol out of the cell, raced her across the prison, and then hurried her up a spiral staircase. They moved at such a frantic pace Bristol had trouble keeping up and had to be dragged a majority of the way. She had no idea what was happening or where they were taking her, and she was too afraid to ask. They reached the top of the staircase and entered the main corridor of the courthouse. The corridor, usually bustling with deputy justices and justices alike, was dark and completely empty. Bristol figured it must have been past midnight, which made the whole situation even more frightening. What could be so important that it required her to be transported in the middle of the night? At the end of the dark corridor, Bristol spotted Brooks pacing in front of a pair of tall double doors. His face was bright red, and he angrily muttered to himself as he moved. "Brooks," she called out. "What's going on? Why are we in the courthouse so late?" "Justice Oldrigade found out who you are," he said. "The guard must have read my note and tipped him off. That bastard! Oldrigade moved up your trial. He's trying to sentence you before Father has time to intervene." "Wait, I don't understand," Bristol said. "When's the trial happening?" "Now," he said. The guards pushed open the double doors and pulled Bristol into the courtroom. Her brother followed closely behind. They were the first to arrive, and Bristol was overwhelmed by her first glimpse. It was easily the biggest room she had ever been in. It was surrounded by massive marble pillars that stretched into the darkness of a seemingly endless ceiling. Wooden risers wrapped around the courtroom with enough seats for 1,000 witnesses. The only source of light came from the 2 torches burning, one on either side of the justice's chair, which was raised on a tall platform at the front of the room. An enormous portrait of King Champion the 14th was hung on the wall behind the platform, and the sovereign scowled down at the courtroom like a judgmental giant. The guards locked Bristol in a tall iron cage that stood in the very center of the room. The bars were so wide she could barely see through them. Brooks took a seat at an empty table to the left of the cage, and Bristol assumed the empty table to her right was reserved for the prosecution deputy. "Try to stay calm," her brother whispered, "and whatever you do, don't say anything. It'll only make things worse." A small door behind the platform opened, and Justice Oldrigade entered the courtroom from his private chambers. Even if he wasn't the justice overseeing her trial, the sight of Oldrigade would have been chilling. He was a skeletal man with a pitch-black beard and large sunken eyes that had pupils the size of pinpricks. His skin was the color of pea soup, and his long fingernails made his hands look like claws. Oldrigade was followed by 4 guards, and to Bristol's horror, an executioner also emerged from the justice's private chambers carrying a large silver axe. Bristol turned to her brother, hoping to find reassurance in his eyes, but Brooks was as alarmed as she was. The trial hadn't even started, and her fate seemed to be sealed. The justice climbed up the steps of the platform and took his seat. He glared down at Bristol with a twisted grin, like a cat gawking at a mouse in a trap. With 3 loud bangs of his gavel, the proceedings began. "The case of Bailey versus the Southern Kingdom shall commence," he announced. "Your Honor, I'd like to remind you that it is illegal to begin a trial without a prosecution deputy," Brooks said. "And furthermore, it is completely unethical to have an executioner present in court before a defendant has been sentenced." "I am aware of the law, defense deputy," the justice sneered. "The prosecution deputy will be here momentarily. However, you, of all people, should not be lecturing me about ethics. It's recently come to my attention that you have made deliberate attempts to conceal information from the court. That is a direct violation of your moral duties as a deputy justice, and violators must be reprimanded." Justice Oldrigade gave the guards a signal, and they covered Bristol's cage with a sheet. Her limited view of the courtroom was now entirely obstructed. "Your Honor, what is the purpose of this?" Brooks objected. "As I'm sure you're aware, defense deputy, whenever a deputy justice is caught committing a violation in court, it is up to the presiding justice to apply an appropriate punishment," Oldrigade explained. "I've decided to teach you a lesson about the importance of transparency. Since you attempted to conceal the defendant's identity from me, her identity will be concealed for the rest of the trial." You are not to speak a word about who she is until after the prosecution deputy has recommended penalties. Let one word slip, and I'll charge you with conspiracy to assist a criminal. Is that understood? Bristol didn't have to see the hatred beaming from her brother's eyes to know it was there. Yes, Your Honor, Brooks said. I understand. Good, Oldergate said. Bring in the prosecution deputy. The double doors creaked open and Bristol heard a new pair of footsteps enter the courtroom. Strangely, the prosecution deputy only made it halfway through the room before he stopped in his tracks. Brooks? A familiar voice asked. Barry? He gasped. You're the prosecution deputy? Bristol felt lightheaded and went weak in the knees. She had to grab the bars of her cage to prevent herself from sliding to the floor. Justice Aldergade was using her trial to get revenge on the Evergreen family, and it was more malicious and cruel than she could ever have imagined. This is my first assignment, Barry said happily. Why didn't you tell me you were the defense deputy on Bailey versus the Southern Kingdom? I was trying to keep it quiet, Brooks said. Why is the defendant covered up? Barry asked. I'm not allowed to discuss it, Brooks said. Barry, listen to me. This trial isn't what it seems. That's quite enough, defense deputy, Justice Oldergade commanded. Thank you for joining us on such short notice, prosecution deputy. Now please step forward and present the charges against the defendant. Barry took his place behind the table to Bristol's right. She heard him remove papers from his briefcase. He cleared his throat before reading them aloud. Your Honor, 3 men witnessed the defendant conjuring a spell from an open book in a private section of the Chariot Hills Library, he said. The first witness was the librarian, Mr. Patwise Woolsore. The other 2 are officers in the King's Royal Guard, and all 3 have signed sworn statements of what they encountered. Given the credibility of the observers, the defendant has been charged with 1 count of trespassing, 1 count of female literacy, and 1 count of committing magic. I will now relinquish the floor to the defense deputy. Given the substantial evidence and the nature of the crimes, we will not waste any time with the defense, Justice Oldergade said. Your Honor, I object, Brooks shouted. Overruled. And watch your tone, defense deputy, the justice warned. Now, moving on. What penalty does the prosecution recommend? This was the moment Bristol had been dreading. With just 2 words, her own brother would either save her life or cement her demise. Her heart was pounding out of her chest, and she forgot to breathe as she waited to hear his answer. Your Honor, due to the number of felonies that were committed in such a short period of time, I believe the defendant may commit more crimes if given the chance. We must remove all likelihood of it happening again, and furthermore, we must prevent all possibility of the defendant harming innocent lives in the process. That is why I must recommend you sentence them with a, Barry, you've got to stop, Brooks shouted. Defense deputy, control yourself, Oldergade ordered. I know you think you're doing the right thing, but you're not. Guards, restrain and silence him immediately. Oldergade is hiding the defendant from you on purpose. Don't recommend a maximum punishment. Trust me, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. Bristol could hear Brooks fighting off the guards as he tried to convince their brother. He grunted and choked as they pinned him down and stuffed a cloth into his mouth. God, you're pathetic, Barry told his brother. Your desire to sabotage me is so great you're willing to make a complete fool of yourself in court. But I'm not as daft as you think. and I won't let you jeopardize my career. Father said I needed to show strength if I wanted the court to take me seriously, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Your Honor, the prosecution recommends the maximum penalty." After hearing her brother's recommendation, Bristol lost all feeling and collapsed to the floor of the cage like a marionette with severed strings. Brooks screamed at the top of his lungs, but the cloth muffled his words. "Then without further notice, I hereby sentence the defendant to death," Justice Oldregade ruled. "The execution shall take place immediately. Guards, please remove the defendant from the cage and position her for the executioner. But first, please restrain the prosecution deputy. This may be unpleasant for him to watch." The guards seized Barry and tied his hands behind his back. He tried to resist them, but they were too strong. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked. "Why am I being restrained? Unhand me at once. I've done nothing wrong." The sheet was removed from the cage, and with one glance at the blue eyes peeking out from inside, Barry realized who the defendant was. "Bristol," he said in shock. But what are you doing in there? You're supposed to be volunteering at the Home for the Helpless." The executioner placed a thick wooden block on the floor below the justice's platform. The guards dragged Bristol out from the cage and positioned her head on the block. As the executioner hovered over her, the reality of what Barry had just done began to sink in. He became manic and struggled against the restraints with all his might. "No!" he screamed. "I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know it was her." Justice Oldregade smiled and cackled at the trauma he was causing the Evergreen family. The executioner raised his axe above Bristol's neck and practiced swinging it. From the floor, Bristol could see both her brothers frantically trying to fight off the guards holding them back. In that moment, she was almost grateful for Oldregade's vengeful tactics. If she was going to die, at least this way she would die looking at the people she loved. "Bristol, I'm sorry," Barry sobbed. "Forgive me. Forgive me." "It's going to be all right, Barry," she whispered. "This isn't your fault. This isn't your fault. This isn't your fault." Wham! The double doors suddenly swung open, causing everyone to jump and turn to the back of the courtroom. Justice Evergreen stormed inside with the rage of 100 men. "Oldregade, stop this blasphemy at once," he demanded. "How dare you interrupt a trial in progress, Evergreen?" Oldregade shouted. "Leave the courtroom this instant or I'll have you removed." "This isn't a trial. It's an atrocity," Justice Evergreen declared. The executioner glanced back and forth at the sparring justices, uncertain of who to take orders from. "Carry on, man," Oldregade yelled. "This is my courtroom. Justice Evergreen has no authority here." "As a matter of fact, I do," Justice Evergreen said, and raised a scroll of parchment high into the air. "I have just returned from High Justice Montclair's home in the western countryside. He has granted me the power to commandeer this trial and overrule your sentencing." The justice unrolled the scroll so everyone in the courtroom could see it. The document was an official order from High Justice Montclair, and his large signature was featured at the bottom. "This is outrageous!" Oldregade exclaimed. "Your daughter is a witch, Evergreen. She must be punished for her crimes." "And punishment she shall receive, but it won't be from you," Justice Evergreen said. "Montclair has sentenced her to live at a facility in the northeast plains of the Southern Kingdom until further notice. The facility, as I'm told, specializes in treating young women with my daughter's condition. There is a carriage outside waiting to transport her as we speak. In the meantime, the High Justice has ordered you to erase any mention of this trial from all records in court. Justice Aldrigate went silent as he contemplated his next move. When he realized how limited his options were, Aldrigate became furious and banged his gavel until it broke into 2 pieces. Well, it appears Justice Evergreen has used his connections to manipulate the law, he told the room. At the moment, I have no other choice but to follow the High Justice's orders. Guards, please take the Evergreen Witch to the carriage outside. Before she had the chance to say goodbye to her brothers, the guards raised Bristol off of the executioner's block and began dragging her out of the courtroom. But, Father, where am I going? She cried. What facility are they taking me to? Father! Despite her desperate pleas, Justice Evergreen refused to answer his daughter's questions. He didn't even look her in the eye as the guards pulled her past him. Don't you dare address me as father, he said. You're no daughter of mine.